Imagine, if you will, living on a street where two families have been locked in this bitter, just seemingly endless feud.
Right, like a total neighborhood rivalry.
Exactly. And it's not just, a casual disagreement over a property line.
Mm.
It is a profound generational animosity that literally defines the entire atmosphere of the block.
Yeah, everybody knows about it.
Right? So as an outsider, or even just someone living a few doors down,
Right.
you have probably internalized a very specific narrative about these two families. You assume they're just, well, fundamentally incompatible.
You figure they've always hated each other.
Yeah, and that they always will. But then, one day, you somehow get access to their respective attics.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right? You start digging through these dusty, centuries-old trunks, and what you find in there completely upends literally everything you thought you knew.
I love this analogy. What do you find?
Well, you discover that the patriarchs of these two families were actually brothers. Yeah. And you find these old financial ledgers proving that during really intense economic depressions, they actively saved each other's businesses from absolute ruin.
That's incredible.
It gets better. You find architectural blueprints showing they literally helped build each other's homes. And like most shockingly of all, you find sacred foundational family charters documents they both still claim to revere today that explicitly instruct them to protect, validate, and honor one another.
I mean, finding something like that, it forces a total cognitive reset, you
Yeah,
know?
it really does.
If you find those documents, you can't really view the current conflict as this inevitable, eternal state of being anymore. I mean, the contemporary hostility doesn't just disappear, obviously.
Right.
The fuse is still happening.
Exactly. But it gets dramatically recontextualized. It becomes a tragic deviation from a much longer, deeply collaborative historical baseline.
And that is exactly what we are setting out to do today on this deep dive.
Absolutely.
We are intentionally stepping away from the 24-hour news cycle. We're looking past the daily headlines, the political punditry, and the algorithmic outrage to challenge a massive, widespread assumption that you, the listener, have likely encountered.
And that assumption is the idea that Muslims and Jews are locked in this permanent, intractable, and fundamentally theological war.
Right. So today we are taking a deep dive into basically 1,400 years of history and the foundational texts of both Islam and Judaism.
It's a huge undertaking, but it's so important.
It is. Our goal is to uncover a narrative of mutual respect, shared theology, and just profound cultural exchange that has been almost entirely eclipsed by modern geopolitics.
And for everyone listening, the foundation for our exploration today comes from two really remarkable pieces of scholarship.
Yes, let's talk about the sources.
Right. So first, we are examining a comprehensive historical and analytical study by Dr. Shoaib Arif. He focuses really deeply on Islamic studies and the historical mechanics of Muslim-Jewish relations.
His historical framework is just mind-blowing.
It really is. And we are pairing his work with a really profound theological treatise by Rabbi Dr. Yakov Nagen.
Right.
And his treatise explores the concept of religious fraternity, but specifically from a deeply observant Orthodox Jewish perspective.
Which adds such a crucial layer to this.
Exactly. Because in our current age of, information overload where nuance is just constantly sacrificed for engagement, understanding the underlying mechanisms of this relationship is essential.
We aren't just cataloging historical trivia here.
No, not at all. We are looking for the architectural blueprints of global coexistence.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to prove that peaceful coexistence isn't just some naive modern utopian theory cooked up in a sociology seminar somewhere, we really have to look at the hard historical reality.
We have to look at the receipts.
Exactly. We have to examine how these groups actually lived together, governed together, and interacted on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Because for centuries, coexistence wasn't the exception to the rule.
No, it was the governing rule itself. It was essentially the operational paradigm of the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world for over a millennium. But to really understand how that functioned, we have to start with this foundational Islamic legal and theological concept.
Okay, lay it on me.
It's called al-Kitab, which translates to the people of the book.
Peaceful the book, okay.
And this wasn't just some poetic descriptor, right? It was a highly specific, totally revolutionary legal designation back in the 7th century.
Because the Quran specifically identifies Jews alongside Christians with this title.
Yes, it explicitly acknowledges that they possess a genuine, divinely inspired scripture.
I want to pause on the mechanics of that for a second, because if you put yourself in the context of the 7th century, empires were generally demanding absolute religious conformity.
Oh, absolutely. Convert or die was pretty standard.
Right. So offering a distinct legal status to a minority religion is fascinating. What does being a person of the book actually translate to when we are talking about laws and taxes and just daily life under Islamic rule?
So historically, this Quranic designation granted Jewish communities a protected status. And this status was known as dhimmi.
Timmy. Okay.
Now, the concept of the dhimmi contract is often really flattened in modern discourse, but structurally, it meant a formalized, institutionalized pluralism.
Meaning they weren't forced to convert.
Exactly. Islamic law provided a social contract where Jewish communities were granted the right to practice their faith openly.
Wow.
And furthermore, they were actually allowed to govern their own internal civic and legal affairs.
So they weren't just subject to Islamic courts for everything.
No, they had their own rabbinical courts to handle matters of like marriage, divorce, inheritance, and just internal community disputes.
So it wasn't just a situation of, hey, we won't kill you if you just keep quiet.
Not at all.
It was a formal recognition of their legal autonomy within the broader state. They could engage in trade, form economic partnerships with Muslims, maintain their distinct cultural identity.
Precisely. It distinguished them entirely from polytheistic groups, who, it's important to note, were not granted the same textual or legal protections.
Right. The polytheists had a much harder time.
They did.
Yeah.
But this contract of protection and autonomy for the people of the book was the bedrock upon which incredibly vibrant periods of collaborative history were built.
And the most famous example of this, the one that always comes up but I feel like rarely gets the detailed attention it actually deserves, is the Golden Age of Andalusia.
Oh, absolutely. Muslim-ruled Spain.
Right. Roughly spanning from the 8th to the 12th centuries. When you read the descriptions of cities like Cordoba, Granada, and Seville during this era, it sounds almost mythological.
It really does.
Like Cordoba had paved, illuminated streets, while cities like London and Paris were essentially just wading through mud.
It was the intellectual capital of the world.
And at the center of this flourishing civilization was this profound intellectual collaboration between Muslims and Jews.
It was a period of just intense intellectual cross-pollination. I mean, you had Jewish viziers, poets, scientists, and physicians operating at the very highest levels of Islamic courts.
Sitting right next to the rulers.
Exactly. They were reading the same ancient Greek philosophical texts, translating them, debating them, and really pushing the boundaries of medicine and mathematics together.
Let's talk about the ultimate embodiment of this era, because we have to mention Maimonides.
Oh, we definitely have to talk about Maimonides.
He is arguably the most influential Jewish philosopher and legal scholar of the Middle Ages. He was born in Cordoba, and what I find so compelling is just how deeply integrated he was into the surrounding Islamic intellectual ecosystem.
He was entirely a product of that environment.
Right. He didn't write his most famous philosophical work, The Guide for the Perplexed, in Hebrew.
No, he didn't.
He wrote it in Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic written with Hebrew letters.
And that linguistic choice is just a perfect metaphor for the whole era. Maimonides was entirely fluent in Islamic philosophical discourse.
He wasn't isolated at all.
Not even a little bit. He engaged deeply with the works of Muslim rationalist thinkers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, and he actually utilized their frameworks, these frameworks of Aristotelian logic, to defend and articulate Jewish theology.
That's wild to think about today.
It is. He wasn't compromising his Jewish identity by engaging with Islamic thought. He was utilizing the shared intellectual language of his time to elevate his own religious tradition.
And practically speaking, he served as the personal physician to Saladin's vizier in Egypt later in his life.
Yes. His life is a real testament to how porous the cultural boundaries were back then.
And this wasn't just some localized phenomenon in Spain, right?
Yeah.
If we shift our focus across the Mediterranean to the Abbasid Caliphate, which stretched from the 8th to the 13th centuries, we see a parallel intellectual explosion centered in Baghdad.
Yes, Baghdad was incredible during this time.
The Abbasids established the House of Wisdom, or the Beit al-Hikmah. This was essentially the greatest library and research institute in the entire world at the time.
The translation movement that occurred there in Baghdad is honestly one of the most significant intellectual endeavors in human history.
And it was heavily collaborative, right?
Profoundly collaborative.
Yeah.
You had Muslim and Jewish scholars literally sitting across from one another at desks, translating massive volumes of ancient Greek, Syriac, and Persian texts into Arabic, and then subsequently into Hebrew.
They were basically backing up the ancient world's hard drive.
That's a great way to put it. They were preserving the knowledge of the ancient world and actively advancing it.
And Dr. Arif's study points out some amazing details here. He details how the Jewish academies in Iraq, specifically these legendary institutions in Susa and Pombedita, they flourished during this exact period under Muslim patronage.
Right. They were essentially the Ivy League of the Jewish world at the time.
Exactly. These academies were the central nerve centers of global Jewish law. The leaders of these academies, who were known as the Gaonim, were issuing legal rulings that shaped Judaism worldwide.
And they were doing all of this while living deeply embedded within a thriving Islamic empire.
Which is just so cool.
And the Islamic legal structures actually influenced the development of Jewish jurisprudence during this time.
Really? How so?
Well, the way legal questions were asked and answered, the systematic codification of the law, there was a methodological exchange happening right alongside the philosophical one.
That makes total sense. Which actually brings us to another really fascinating historical pivot point, the Ottoman Empire. And this is where the contrast between the Islamic world and Christian Europe becomes, like, incredibly stark.
Oh, completely night and day.
You have to look at the events of 1492.
1492 is a major watershed moment. Christian Europe, specifically the newly unified Catholic monarchies of Spain and, soon after Portugal, they issue the Alhambra Decree.
Right.
And they essentially present their massive, deeply rooted Jewish populations with a brutal ultimatum. Convert to Christianity, leave immediately, or be executed.
Just a horrific choice.
It marks the culmination of the Spanish Inquisition, which was a period characterized by horrific massacres, forced conversions, and literally the burning of heretics at the stake.
So you have hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing the Iberian Peninsula. They are stripped of all their wealth and desperately seeking asylum. Where do they go?
They certainly don't go north into Europe where anti-Semitism is just rampant.
Exactly. They head east and south, directly into the Islamic world. And the Ottoman Sultan at the time, Bayezid II, he doesn't just reluctantly let them in. He actively welcomes them.
He issued formal decrees to his provincial governors commanding them to receive the Jewish refugees cordially. He explicitly forbade anyone from denying them entry or treating them with contempt.
There is this famous historical anecdote regarding Sultan Bayezid II that I think perfectly captures the geopolitical reality of that moment.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
Yeah. He is reported to have remarked something to the effect of, "You venture to call Ferdinand a wise ruler, he who has impoverished his own country and enriched mine."
That's a great quote.
Right. The Ottomans totally understood that bringing in a highly educated, skilled, and cosmopolitan population was a massive strategic advantage.
It was smart statecraft. And the Ottomans integrated them using a really sophisticated legal framework known as the millet system.
The millet system. How did that differ from the dhimmi status?
Well, building on the earlier concept of the dhimmi, the millet system recognized the Jewish community as a distinct, legally protected nation within the empire.
Like a nation within a nation.
Exactly. They were granted sweeping autonomy. They managed their own taxation, their own education, justice systems, and religious affairs.
Wow.
Cities like Istanbul, Salonika, and Izmir became booming centers of Jewish life, full of printing presses and textile manufacturing, and it was all operating seamlessly within the framework of this vast Islamic empire.
Okay, I am going to jump in here, though.
Sure.
Because as a critical learner, and I know our listeners are thinking this too, I find myself inherently skeptical of anything that sounds too perfect.
Fair enough.
I want to push back on this narrative slightly. We are painting a picture of this intellectual and social paradise. But when I look at the actual mechanics of the millet system or the dhimmi status, it looks an awful lot like a gated community.
Ah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, sure, you have physical security and you can run your own neighborhood, but you are undeniably a second-class citizen. You are structurally subordinate to the Muslim majority. For instance, the dhimmi were required to pay a special, distinct tax called the jizya.
Right.
And to me, that doesn't exactly scream equality.
That is a crucial and totally necessary pushback. If we are going to treat history seriously on this deep dive, we cannot sanitize it. And we can't view it through the anachronistic lens of 21st century liberal democracy.
Right, we can't project our modern values backwards.
Exactly. You are absolutely correct that the dhimmi status was not a framework of modern egalitarian citizenship. It was a framework of formalized tolerance, but it was based on a clear hierarchy where Islam was supreme.
So it was tolerance, but with very firm, non-negotiable boundaries.
Yes. The jizya was indeed a specific poll tax levied on non-Muslim subjects. And in addition to the tax, there were, at various times and under various rulers, specific sumptuary laws.
What are sumptuary laws?
Basically, rules dictating what colors non-Muslims could wear, or restrictions on building new houses of worship, or even rules against riding horses.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And we also have to acknowledge there were periods, like under the Almohad dynasty in 12th century Spain, where this tolerance violently broke down and Jews faced severe persecution and forced conversion. It was definitely not an unbroken utopia.
So how do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile the structural subordination and the periods of actual persecution with this broader narrative of a golden age?
We do it by maintaining historical proportionality. We have to evaluate historical frameworks against the available alternatives of their era, not against modern ideals.
Okay, that makes sense.
When you contextualize the Islamic world against medieval Christian Europe at the exact same time, the disparity in safety and flourishing is staggering.
Because Europe was just a nightmare.
Exactly. In Europe, Jewish communities were facing the Crusades, rampant blood libels, massacres blamed on the bubonic plague, and total violent expulsions from entire countries like England and France.
Right. So in Europe, the debate was often whether Jews should be allowed to exist at all. Whereas in the Islamic world, the debate was about the specific legal parameters of their existence.
Precisely. And the jizya tax, for instance, it's often misunderstood. It actually exempted the dhimmi from military service and explicitly bound the Islamic State to protect them from external enemies.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Furthermore, Muslim citizens were paying their own obligatory wealth tax, which is the zakat. So while the dhimmi status definitely codified a subordinate social tier, practically it functioned as a remarkably durable comparative safe haven.
It allowed Judaism to survive.
Survive, adapt, and produce some of its most extraordinary theological and cultural achievements.
Okay, that makes total sense. The historical baseline is clear. Despite structural inequalities and occasional breakdowns, the overwhelming norm was coexistence, economic integration, and intellectual exchange.
Right.
But history is ultimately a byproduct of belief, right? People construct societies based on what they believe to be true about the universe.
Absolutely.
So if Jewish communities were generally thriving within Islamic societies, how does Jewish theology actually process the existence of Islam? Like, what do the rabbis, the legal codes, and the sacred texts actually say about the faith of their neighbors?
And this brings us right to the core of Rabbi Dr. Yakov Nagen's research. What his work reveals is that Judaism possesses a highly developed, robust theological framework for validating other religious paths.
Okay.
And it actually reserves a particularly unique and elevated status for Islam.
Let's loop back to Maimonides for a moment, because his rulings are central here, right?
Yeah.
You established earlier that he lived immersed in Islamic culture, but he didn't just study their philosophy. He actually made authoritative, binding legal declarations about the nature of their faith.
He did?
He explicitly ruled that Muslims unify God with a proper, unblemished unification.
And I need to stress, the legal gravity of that statement within Judaism cannot be overstated. Halakha, which is Jewish law, is incredibly strict regarding the concept of monotheism.
Right. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one.
Exactly. The absolute, indivisible unity of God is the foundational pillar of the Jewish faith. Anything that compromises that unity, like attributing physical form to God or dividing God into parts, is categorized as idolatry.
Which is a huge deal.
It is one of the most severe prohibitions in Judaism.
So when Maimonides uses a phrase like unblemished unification, he isn't just giving a compliment. He is making a highly technical theological assessment.
Yes. He is declaring that the Islamic conception of Tawhid, which is the absolute oneness of God, is perfectly aligned with the Jewish conception of God.
Wow.
He is stating, as a matter of religious law, that Muslims are not idolaters. They are praying to the exact same creator, the God of Abraham, in a completely valid and pure manner.
And this isn't just like an abstract medieval debate, right? Because this has incredibly immediate practical implications for how observant Jews interact with the Islamic world today.
Very much so.
Rabbi Nagen's treatise highlights rulings from some of the most prominent rabbinic authorities of the 20th and 21st centuries.
Right, like Rabbi Nebenzal and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef.
Yes. For example, Rabbi Avigdor Nebenzal, the former chief rabbi of the Old City of Jerusalem, and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who was this enormously influential former Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel. Both of these towering figures explicitly ruled that mosques are sacred spaces.
And the halakhic reasoning behind that is fascinating because mosques are dedicated exclusively to the unblemished unification of the one God. Jewish law formally recognizes them as houses of God.
So they have actual holy status in Jewish law.
Exactly. Therefore, it is strictly forbidden for a Jew to desecrate a mosque, to act frivolously inside one, or to treat it with anything less than profound reverence.
There is a story about Rabbi Ovadia Yosef that I found incredibly moving in the sources.
Oh, about when he was in Cairo.
Yes, back in 1947, he was serving as a rabbi in Cairo, Egypt. And there were times when he found himself in a situation where he needed to pray his daily prayers, but he could not locate a synagogue nearby.
Right.
According to his own rulings and practice, he would actively prefer to go inside a local mosque to pray, rather than praying out on the street or in a secular building.
I mean, just think about the theological confidence that requires to walk into the sanctuary of another world religion, lay out your Jewish prayer book, and feel spiritually at home because you inherently recognize the space is dedicated to your God.
It's beautiful.
It is a profound acknowledgement of shared spiritual real estate.
And this mutual recognition, it actually stems from a broader structural concept within Judaism that I think is often totally misunderstood by those outside the faith. I'm talking about the 7 Noahide laws.
Right. This is a really critical piece of the puzzle because it explains the foundational difference in how Judaism approaches the rest of humanity. Judaism is not a proselytizing religion.
Right. You don't see Jewish missionaries handing out pamphlets.
Exactly. It does not send out missionaries seeking to convert the world. And the theological reason for this is that Judaism simply does not believe that a person needs to be Jewish to achieve salvation, to be loved by God, or to secure a place in the world to come.
The Talmud explicitly states that the righteous of the nations have a portion in heaven.
Yes. And the theological mechanism for this is the covenant of Noah. Jewish tradition teaches that God gave humanity 7 basic universal moral imperatives after the flood. These are the Noahide laws.
What are they? Exactly.
They include establishing systems of justice and then prohibitions against idolatry, blasphemy, murder, theft, sexual immorality, and cruelty to animals.
Pretty universal moral baselines.
Exactly. If a non-Jew adheres to these baseline ethical principles, they're considered righteous. They have fulfilled their cosmic purpose.
But the sources make this compelling argument that when Judaism looks at Islam, it doesn't just see a group of people, scraping by on the bare minimum of the Noahide laws.
Not at all.
Islam goes vastly beyond those baseline ethics and actually mirrors the deepest, most rigorous pillars of Jewish practice.
The structural parallels are astonishing when you examine them side by side. Take the concept of charity, for example. In Judaism, the concept of tzedakah is not merely optional philanthropy. It is an obligatory act of justice and righteousness.
Right.
Well, in Islam, the concept of zakat or tzedakah functions in exactly the same way. It is an obligatory pillar of faith centered on economic justice.
They even share the exact same linguistic root.
Yes, they do.
And then you look at the mechanics of spiritual purification. The Jewish calendar centers on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is characterized by intense fasting, prayer, and repentance.
And the Islamic calendar features the month of Ramadan.
Exactly. A prolonged period of fasting, self-reflection, and spiritual discipline. And then you have the rituals of daily fixed prayer times, the dietary laws of kosher and halal. The operational rhythms of the two faiths are just remarkably synchronized.
Which really explains why, throughout history, leading Jewish theologians haven't just tolerated Islam, they have actually viewed its emergence as an active manifestation of the divine will.
Right. Look at Rabbi Natan al-Fayumi. He was a prominent 12th century Jewish leader in Yemen. He wrote a philosophical work where he actually analyzed the Quran.
And his conclusion was remarkable.
It really was. He concluded that the Quran was a legitimate, authentic, divine revelation explicitly tailored for the Arab people. He argued that God, in his infinite wisdom, sends different prophets to different nations with legislation suited to their specific cultural and historical context.
I mean, that is a staggering level of pluralism for the 12th century.
Truly ahead of his time.
And you see a similar, perhaps even more expansive view later from Rabbi Yakov Nagen in the 18th century.
What did he say?
Well, he looked at the massive global spread of both Islam and Christianity and argued that this was not a historical accident. He saw it as a divinely orchestrated process. He believed that the rapid expansion of Islam was literally the hand of God working through history to eradicate paganism, bring billions of people to the awareness of the one creator, and ultimately prepare the entire world for a messianic era where humanity serves God in unison.
It frames Islam not as a competitor, but as a vital partner in a grand cosmic project of monotheism,
Exactly.
which perfectly tees up one of the most evocative pieces of imagery in Rabbi Nagen's treatise. He points to the biblical book of Zephaniah, specifically chapter 3, verse 9.
It's a beautiful verse.
The prophet envisions a future where God purifies the speech of all nations, so that they may all call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one shoulder.
With one shoulder. It is a highly specific, very physical metaphor for unified labor.
And Rabbi Nagen shares a personal anecdote in the source that really brings this ancient text to life. He recounts attending an interfaith gathering and embracing his friend and colleague, Imam Dr. Talib Sharif.
Right.
He describes the physical sensation of that hug standing side by side, their shoulders pressed against one another. And in that moment, he realized that Zephaniah's prophecy isn't just a poetic abstraction. Meeting someone from a different faith, shoulder to shoulder, is a literal, physical manifestation of serving God.
That's incredibly powerful.
The horizontal connection between two human beings actually validates and strengthens the vertical connection to the divine.
And that realization is the crux of why this matters for you, the listener. It addresses a fundamental anxiety of the modern age. This fear that recognizing the validity of someone else's truth inherently diminishes your own.
Like it's a zero-sum game.
Exactly. But this theology proves that you can hold a fierce, traditional, unyielding religious identity without invalidating the spiritual legitimacy of your neighbor. You can believe your path is an absolute divine command for you without believing that the other person's path is inherently flawed or doomed.
Okay, so we've established that Jewish theology, grounded in halakha and the concept of Noahide laws, possesses the architecture to view Islam as a legitimate, divinely guided path.
Yes.
The natural, inevitable question is, does Islamic theology reciprocate? Does the Quran view Judaism with the same level of theological legitimacy?
And here's where it gets really interesting.
Because it does.
Yeah.
The Quran engages with the Jewish narrative more extensively than almost any other topic.
The textual engagement is profound. If you analyze the Quran quantitatively, the figure who appears most frequently by a massive margin is Moses.
Really?
Yes. He is mentioned over 130 times. The narrative of the Exodus, the liberation from Egypt, the wandering in the desert, these are foundational motifs in Islamic scripture.
The Quran explicitly and repeatedly acknowledges the covenant made between God and the Israelites at Mount Sinai. It doesn't treat it as a myth. It treats it as a binding historical truth.
It explicitly recognizes the Torah as a divine revelation. Surah Al-Ma'idah, which we will discuss in depth in a minute, contains a verse stating, "Indeed, we sent down the Torah, in which was guidance and light."
And Dr. Arif's historical analysis includes a hadith, which, for our listeners, is a recorded tradition of the actions and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that I think perfectly encapsulates this early reverence.
Ah, the story of the cushion.
Yes. According to the tradition, a group of people brought a physical scroll of the Torah to Muhammad, asking him to adjudicate a dispute based on its laws. And how does he respond? He asks for a cushion. He gently places the physical Torah scroll upon the cushion, and then he declares, "I believed in thee and in him who revealed thee."
We have to analyze the physical mechanics of that action. In a culture where the positioning of objects denotes their spiritual hierarchy, placing the text on a cushion, elevating it, protecting it from the ground, is an ultimate sign of reverence.
It's a huge sign of respect.
Exactly. He is modeling a posture of profound respect for the prior revelation.
But of course, theology is never simple. Over centuries of interpretation, debate, and obviously political conflict, certain theological mechanisms have been utilized to argue that Islam effectively invalidated or replaced Judaism.
Right, the supersessionist arguments.
Exactly. Dr. Arif and Rabbi Nagen tackle the two biggest theological hurdles head-on in their work. The first is the concept of nask, and the second is takrif. Let's unpack nask first.
Okay.
Because to an outsider, it sounds like the theological equivalent of canceling a subscription. It translates roughly to abrogation. The popular claim is that Islam canceled Judaism, that the Quran is an updated operating system that renders all previous software totally obsolete.
That is a common assertion, but the scholarship provided in our sources argues that it is a severe, almost reckless misapplication of Islamic jurisprudence.
How so?
Well, nask is a highly technical legal tool used by Islamic scholars to resolve apparent contradictions within the text. If one verse prescribes a certain punishment and a later verse prescribes a different one, nask allows the later ruling to abrogate the earlier one.
So it's a tool for managing legal updates within the community.
Exactly. It applies to specific legal injunctions like tax codes, inheritance distributions, procedural rules for prayer. What classical Islamic scholars emphasize is that Nas cannot and does not apply to historical facts or core theological doctrine.
Oh, that's a huge distinction.
Massive. You cannot abrogate the fact that God made a covenant with Abraham. You cannot abrogate the inherent oneness of God. Therefore, the foundational validity of the previous revelations cannot be canceled by a legal mechanism that was just meant for managing community laws.
And the chronological timeline of the Quran actually reinforces this. Let's look at Surah Al-Ma'idah, which, as you mentioned, contains some of the most beautiful and explicit affirmations of the Torah's light and guidance.
Right.
According to Islamic tradition, specifically citing a prominent quote attributed to Aisha, the Prophet's wife, Surah Al-Ma'idah, is considered one of the very final surahs revealed.
And that chronological placement is the ultimate counterargument to abrogation. If the final words delivered to the community contain an explicit validation of the Torah, it is logically impossible for those verses to be abrogated.
Because there's nothing coming after it to cancel it.
Exactly. As Aisha is recorded to have said regarding the surah, the probability of any abrogation does not exist there.
Okay, so Naskh doesn't erase the prior covenants. Let's move to the second hurdle, takrif. This translates to distortion or corruption.
Right.
The argument here is that the physical Torah that Jews read today is a forgery, that it was manipulated, rewritten, and corrupted by rabbis over the centuries, meaning the modern Jewish text is not the text God actually revealed.
Which is a devastating theological accusation.
Totally.
If the text is fundamentally fraudulent, the entire concept of the people of the book collapses because the book itself is invalid.
But the sources trace this argument back to its roots and find a really critical distinction. They point to the commentary of Ibn Abbas, who was the paternal cousin of Muhammad, and is considered one of the most authoritative early voices on Quranic exegesis.
Right. He clarified the mechanics of takrif.
What did he say?
He argued that the distortion referenced in the Quran was tarif al-mani, which is the distortion of meaning or interpretation. It was not tarif al-nas, the distortion of the physical text itself.
The distinction is vital.
It really is. Ibn Abbas was accusing certain individuals of willfully misinterpreting the verses, of twisting the meaning of the words verbally to suit a political or social agenda. He was explicitly not claiming that the physical ink on the parchment had been altered.
And that logical through line connects personally back to the hadith with the cushion. If Muhammad believed the physical scroll handed to him was a corrupted forgery, he would not have elevated it on a cushion. He would not have bowed to a fake document and said, "I believed in thee." His actions confirm Ibn Abbas's interpretation. The text itself remains holy, even if humans occasionally bungle its interpretation.
This raises an important question, however, and we must address it directly.
Yeah, we can't ignore the hard stuff.
Anyone who has read the Quran or who has consumed media covering this topic knows there are specific verses that are exceptionally critical of Jews. It is the theological elephant in the room.
It is.
There are verses that speak of divine wrath and, perhaps most infamously, verses that appear to compare Jews to apes and swine.
Yeah, we absolutely have to talk about the apes verse, because when that is quoted out of context on social media or in political propaganda, it sounds like pure vitriolic racial condemnation. It sounds like anti-Semitism codified right into Scripture.
And tragically, it has been weaponized exactly that way by extremist elements for decades. But the historical and textual context provided in the sources changes the mechanics of the verse entirely. The Quran is not making a blanket statement about the Jewish soul or the Jewish race.
Who is it talking about then?
That specific condemnation was directed at a highly localized, specific community of Israelites living in a coastal town who were willfully and repeatedly violating the Sabbath.
Let's dig into why that matters. The Sabbath isn't just like a day off. In Jewish theology, the Sabbath is the ultimate sign of the covenant between God and the Israelites. Breaking it publicly was a repudiation of their specific relationship with God.
Exactly. The Quran's harsh critique is actually an affirmation of the immense importance of the Jewish covenant. The text is condemning them precisely because they are breaking a divine commandment that they are uniquely obligated to uphold.
That is a fascinating way to look at it.
And crucially, this is the part that is almost always omitted. The Quran explicitly praises the other Jews in that exact same town who tried to stop the violators.
Ah, so it is a critique of a specific behavior, not an indictment of a bloodline.
Yes. The same logic applies to the term wrathful. The sources analyze how this term is deployed. It refers to a highly specific historical moment. The generation of Israelites who sinned in the desert by constructing and worshiping the golden calf while Moses was up on the mountain.
Which is an event meticulously documented in the Torah itself. The Torah is furious about it.
Yes, and the Quran just recounts it. But what is vital is that just a few verses after describing God's wrath over the golden calf, the Quran explicitly states that God pardoned them and forgave them.
So it's not a permanent curse.
No, it is recounting a historical cycle of profound sin followed by divine redemption. It is not slapping a permanent, inescapable label of wrathful onto all Jewish people for the rest of eternity.
What's fascinating here is how incredibly self-aware the Quran is about the human tendency to read a critique and use it to justify bigotry.
It really anticipates that danger.
It totally does. It anticipates the danger of stereotyping. After delivering these harsh critiques of specific historical failures, Surah 3 explicitly hits the brakes. It states regarding the people of the book, they are not all alike. Among the people of the book is an upright community.
It's beautiful.
It practically commands the reader, do not generalize, look at the nuance, judge the individual's righteousness.
It is a remarkable textual safeguard against prejudice.
You know, reading these Quranic critiques actually reminds me intensely of reading the Hebrew Bible itself.
How so?
Well, if you read the biblical prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they are absolutely brutal in their condemnation of the Jewish people.
Oh yeah, they pull no punches.
They call them a stiff-necked people, a rebellious nation, a generation of vipers. They describe God's absolute fury at their hypocrisy. But nobody reads the book of Isaiah and concludes that Isaiah was a rabid anti-Semite.
Right, because the reader understands it as an internal critique. It is a loving, if furious, demand for spiritual elevation.
Exactly. The sources suggest that the Quran is utilizing these narratives in a very similar way. It is using the grand, sweeping history of the Israelites as a school for humanity. The Israelites are the case study.
That makes a lot of sense.
Their story illustrates the universal human tendency to become arrogant, to break covenants, to prioritize greed over justice, and it demonstrates the constant, urgent need for spiritual course correction. It's a shared spiritual curriculum.
But as we move into the modern era, we are forced to confront a devastating reality. That shared curriculum was profoundly disrupted.
It really was.
We have established a deep, complex theological framework of brotherhood and a centuries-long history of baseline coexistence. So how did we get from Maimonides and the House of Wisdom to the deeply fractured, volatile, and often violently opposed reality we see dominating the headlines today?
And this brings us to the most difficult part of our deep dives, the 20th century rupture.
Right.
Before we examine the historical mechanics of this shift, I want to establish our parameters, Clay.
Very important.
In this next segment, we are going to look at the collision of two massive, deeply traumatized national movements. We're going to present the dual narratives exactly as they are laid out in the historical analyses of Dr. Arif and the sociological frameworks referenced by Rabbi Nagen. Our goal here is not to litigate the past or to declare a political victor.
Right, we were just looking at the source material.
Exactly. Our goal is to understand the psychological and historical tectonic shift that altered the trajectory of Muslim-Jewish relations. We are strictly reporting the facts from the sources.
It requires immense objectivity because the history we are about to discuss represents existential trauma for both communities.
Absolutely.
The shift away from the theological paradigm we've been discussing really begins to accelerate in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The entire organizing principle of the world changes.
From religion to nationalism.
Exactly. For centuries, identity was primarily religious. But with the collapse of empires and the sprawling legacy of European colonialism, the defining paradigm shifted to nationalism.
The sources outline the inevitable collision of two emerging nationalisms converging on the exact same geography. On one side, you have the rise of the Zionist movement.
Right.
It's crucial to understand that Zionism did not emerge in a vacuum. It originated primarily in Europe as a desperate, urgent response to centuries of escalating horrific anti-Semitism pogroms in Russia, the Dreyfus Affair in France, and a growing realization that Jewish life in Europe was fundamentally precarious.
It was about survival.
Zionism was a movement seeking a sovereign, safe homeland for the Jewish people in their ancestral historical land. It was a project of national self-determination.
And on the other side, you have the Arab, Muslim, and Christian populations living in that exact region. As the Ottoman Empire began to disintegrate, they were concurrently developing their own fervent aspirations for national independence and self-rule.
Two national movements, one piece of land.
Exactly. The sources note that while there were periods where early Jewish migration and investment were actually welcomed for bringing economic development, deep alarm and organized resistance quickly grew.
And that alarm was heavily compounded by the intervention of Western imperial powers.
Colonialism really complicated things.
It did. The Arab population increasingly perceived the Zionist project not just as a migration, but as a colonial imposition, especially after the 1917 Balfour Declaration.
Right, where the British Empire stepped in.
Yes, the British Empire, an outside colonial force, formally declared its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
These escalating tensions culminate in the defining year of 1948. And the sources present the events of 1948 through a stark, irreconcilable dual narrative. It is literally a tale of two entirely different realities coexisting in the exact same moment.
For the global Jewish community, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was a moment of miraculous, unprecedented, historic triumph.
It was the culmination of everything they'd prayed for.
Literally, a 2,000-year-old daily prayer to return to Jerusalem. And crucially, it occurred immediately in the wake of the Holocaust, the darkest, most industrialized slaughter in Jewish history. Israel represented survival, sovereignty, and a guarantee that the Jewish people would never again be defenseless.
But for the Palestinian people, 1948 is known as the Nakba, which translates to the catastrophe.
Right.
The sources detail the agonizing reality that during the ensuing war, over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced. They were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes, resulting in a massive generational refugee crisis.
It created a condition of statelessness.
Statelessness, loss of land, and profound disenfranchisement that persists as the core of the conflict today.
And there's a massive historical ripple effect from 1948 that Dr. Arif's study highlights, which is astonishingly overlooked in casual mainstream historical narratives.
Well, that's that.
Well, we spent the first half of this deep dive talking about the incredibly vibrant, deeply rooted Jewish communities in Baghdad, Cairo, and throughout the Islamic world.
Right, the Golden Age communities.
In the decades immediately following 1948, those communities essentially vanished. Between 800,000 and 1 million Jews fled or were expelled from Muslim-majority countries across the Middle East and North Africa.
It was a rapid, devastating severing of the pluralistic fabric we discussed earlier. The Islamic world lost an integral, ancient component of its cultural and economic diversity.
It really was a tragic loss.
And those Jewish communities who had lived in places like Iraq and Yemen for literally millennia arrived in Israel carrying the deep trauma of forced exile and the loss of their entire heritage.
It fundamentally altered the demographics and the psychology of the region. It's a tragic rupture. It feels akin to a devastating family feud, where the shared ancestry, the fact that both communities trace their profound theological lineage back to Abraham through his sons Isaac and Ishmael, actually becomes a source of agonizing tension rather than a point of unity.
The proximity makes the betrayal feel sharper.
It really does.
The late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, a brilliant philosophical mind, coined a term for the psychological state that emerges from this kind of protracted conflict. The sources reference it heavily. He called it pathological dualism.
Pathological dualism. Let's break down what that actually does to a society's brain.
So pathological dualism is a mindset where a community views the other not merely as a political opponent or a competitor for resources, but as an absolute ontological existential threat.
Like they represent pure evil.
Exactly.
Right.
The world gets entirely bifurcated into pure, unadulterated good, which is us, and pure, irredeemable evil, which is them.
And when a society is locked into that mindset, driven by competing narratives of profound, unresolved pain, the trauma of the Holocaust on one side, the ongoing daily reality of Palestinian displacement and occupation on the other, that beautiful, nuanced theological brotherhood we just spent 45 minutes unpacking gets completely obscured.
It gets buried.
Theology doesn't disappear, it gets weaponized.
Exactly. Trauma becomes the dominant lens through which the holy texts are read. If you are terrified of the other, if you believe they are trying to eradicate you, you will instinctively scour your scriptures to find the specific verses that justify your fear and validate your anger.
And you ignore the rest.
Yes. You will systematically ignore or explain away the verses that command fraternity, empathy, and mutual respect. The history of coexistence gets dismissed as an irrelevant fairy tale.
Which brings us to the ultimate pivotal question of our deep dive. If trauma rewrites theology, how do we rewrite it back? Is there a path forward?
It's the most important question.
How do we take the profound theological architecture we discussed in the first half of our journey and use it to begin healing the devastating historical rupture we just covered?
The sources do outline a framework for rebuilding, and interestingly, they suggest that one of the most potent catalysts for this reconciliation is actually emerging from shared adversity, particularly in the diaspora.
Right. The landscape looks very different when you move away from the immediate epicenter of the geopolitical conflict. In Western nations like the United States, Canada, parts of Europe, Muslims, and Jews find themselves in a fascinating parallel situation.
They are both minorities.
Exactly. They are both minority, highly visible religious groups trying to navigate deeply secular societies.
And they're facing nearly identical external pressures and threats. The sources highlight how both communities are targets of rising white nationalism.
Which is terrifying.
It is. They both experience horrific vandalism of their sacred spaces, cemeteries, and community centers. They both face legislative attacks on their religious practices.
What kind of legislative attacks?
Well, such as European bans on religious clothing like the hijab or the kippah, as well as concerted efforts to ban religious slaughter practices required for halal and kosher meat.
This shared vulnerability has forced a very pragmatic, necessary alliance. You are seeing the emergence of powerful grassroots movements. In the United States, the sources point to the Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council.
Oh, they do great work.
They really do. This is a robust, bipartisan coalition that actively lobbies and works together on a national level to protect religious freedoms and combat hate crimes against both groups.
Because they recognize that an attack on the religious liberty of one is an immediate existential threat to the other.
But the hope isn't limited to the safety of the West. Perhaps the most courageous examples the sources highlight are the joint initiatives happening right in the volatile heart of the conflict itself.
Yes, in the Middle East.
Organizations like Roots, which operates under the names Shirashim in Hebrew and Judur in Arabic. They're based in the West Bank, arguably the most contested, tense real estate on the planet. And what they do is quietly extraordinary.
They bring people together.
They bring local Israelis and local Palestinians together for facilitated conversations.
And these are not superficial kumbaya sessions where everyone pretends the conflict doesn't exist. They are agonizingly painful, incredibly raw, honest dialogues. People are sharing their deepest traumas and their deepest fears.
But the conversations are fundamentally grounded in a mutual refusal to surrender to pathological dualism.
Yeah.
They are proving, on a micro level, that profound political disagreement does not necessitate the demonization of the other's humanity.
To anchor this back in the theology, which is where this entire journey started, the sources return us to a specific quote from the Quran, from Surah Al-Ma'idah.
What does it say?
It reads, "So vie with one another in good deeds. Unto God shall be your return altogether, and he will inform you of that wherein you differ."
Vie with one another in good deeds. It is a breathtakingly pragmatic, almost shockingly simple directive.
It is a theological release valve for human conflict.
It really is. It essentially says, look, humanity is diverse. You are going to have deep, intractable theological disagreements about the nature of revelation. You're going to have massive political disputes, but resolving those ultimate cosmic differences.
That is above your pay grade.
Exactly. That is God's job, to be sorted out in the afterlife. Humanity's job, right now, down here in the dirt and the mess of the real world, is simply to compete with one another in taking care of people. It's a divine mandate to put down the theological swords and pick up a trowel.
It redirects the competitive energy of religious fervor away from dominance and towards societal benefit.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner listening to this today? When you take a massive step back and look at the entire panoramic landscape we've covered, from the intellectual brilliance of the Andalusian Golden Age and the translation tables of Baghdad, through the deep structural, mutual theological validation of the texts, into the agonizing tragedy of the 20th century, and finally to the quiet, stubborn hope of the grassroots movements today.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. We live in a world that constantly, aggressively demands that we pick a side. The algorithms demand we entrench ourselves in an echo chamber, flatten the complexity of the world, and just hate the other.
But there is an alternative.
There is. The sources we've unpacked today suggest something radical. They suggest that the true fundamentalist approach, meaning a literal return to the fundamental, foundational texts and historical baselines of Judaism and Islam, actually demands the exact opposite of what the extremists claim.
Right.
True fundamentalism demands compassion. It demands intellectual curiosity. It demands mutual respect. It demands the arduous, difficult work of seeing the divine image in the exact person you are being told is your mortal enemy.
This raises a final crucial question. Religion is so frequently and often accurately blamed for exacerbating the conflict in the Middle East. It is undeniably weaponized by extremists to justify horrific violence and intransigence.
Absolutely.
But if the profound theological alignments we've explored in these sources are accurate, religion might actually be the only tool powerful enough to solve the conflict.
That is a profound thought.
Secular treaties, economic incentives, and political borders are necessary, but they only address the surface mechanics of a society. They cannot heal a wounded soul. Only a theological framework that inherently validates the existence and spiritual worth of the other possesses the power to finally disarm pathological dualism.
Okay, let's bring this massive journey all together. We started today by looking at what seemed to be a terminal diagnosis of a broken relationship, a landscape clouded entirely by modern headlines that promise nothing but inevitable, endless war.
And we dug through the stratigraphy of 1,400 years of history to uncover a completely different operational baseline. We explored the intellectual flourishing of Andalusia and the Abbasid Caliphate, eras where Jewish and Muslim scholars literally built the foundations of modern philosophy and science together.
We unpacked the incredible structural theological bridges. We examined Jewish halakhic rulings by towering figures like Maimonides and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef that validate Islamic monotheism and mandate the reverence of mosques as sacred spaces.
We really went deep.
We did. We analyzed profound Quranic mechanics, debunking the misuse of nask and takrif, to reveal scriptures that honor the Torah, respect the ongoing Jewish covenant, and explicitly warn humanity against the dangers of religious exclusivity and prejudice.
We impartially and soberly examined the tragic 20th century rupture, acknowledging how the volatile collision of nationalisms, the generational trauma of the Holocaust, the devastating reality of the Nakba, and the massive exodus of Jews from the Islamic world created a suffocating cycle of pain and competing narratives.
And finally, we look at how individuals and grassroots movements are actively using those ancient shared theological values to build a shared future, taking the Quran's advice to compete not in geopolitical dominance, but in good deeds.
Which leaves us with a final, deeply provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day.
A concept drawn directly from the deepest implications of the texts we've studied. If you look closely at everything we've discussed, the texts essentially argue for a radical, inescapable interdependency. Judaism acts as the essential historical witness to the fundamental building blocks of Islam. The concept of prophethood, the mechanics of a divine covenant, the revolutionary idea of a single God actively intervening in human history.
And Islam, in turn, successfully took that foundational monotheism, nurtured it, and spread it to billions of people across the globe.
Exactly. Acting as a massive, unparalleled vehicle for the original mission given to Abraham. They are fundamentally intertwined. One cannot fully, historically, or theologically understand its own narrative without the living witness of the other.
So if that radical interdependency is true, what does that mean for the future of global diplomacy?
That is the big question.
Could it be that the ultimate lasting resolution to Middle Eastern tension won't come from a sterile boardroom in Geneva or a newly drawn map negotiated by secular superpowers? Could it be that true peace will only arrive from a profound, courageous return to these exact religious roots?
The very roots, the very texts that are currently being blamed for the division might actually hold the only viable cure.
It's definitely something to think about.
Think about that the next time you see a headline designed to make you angry. Keep questioning the simplistic narratives you are handed. Keep learning, keep digging into the sources, and try to view this complex, beautiful world with just a little bit more nuance.
Remember the attic.
Exactly. Because as we saw in the attics today, those two rival families fighting on the street, they hold the ancient documents that prove, undeniably, that they are meant to be brothers. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring.